Okay, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending where you're joining from. I hope your Tisha B'Av is going okay. The story of MASADA is a story which has inspired countless of generations for the last 2,000 years. It's a story that's inspired hope and courage and strength, especially to Jewish people and to others, particularly in the most dangerous and precarious of times. It's a story that has inspired us and told us that even if the Jewish body may die, the Jewish spirit will never die. Or is it really that way? Is that really the message and the lesson we can learn from MASADA? Maybe there's something else that we need to know about MASADA. Just 1 minute. Okay. That's the question that I want to explore with you today. And there's so much beautiful literature and discussion about this. So it's so appropriate on Tisha B'Av when we're focusing on destruction and persecution of Jewish communities, of Jewish sovereignty in Israel, that we talk about this story and we have a chance to analyze it a little bit. And of course, as I always say, it's so easy and convenient to sit in your air-conditioned home in 2020 when you have all the luxuries surrounded around you, and to look back in hindsight and start to analyze and cast judgment on people from 2,000 years ago who were in situations that we can't even dream or imagine about. So I say very clearly, we're not casting any judgment on anybody. We're just trying to understand this. Hopefully it'll be something we only have to ever talk about in the theory or in the past, and not something we ever can or will experience ourselves. So for those of you that don't know or don't know entirely, what is the story of MASADA? During the 60s before the Common Era, around the year 63, 66 before the Common Era, the Romans already were invading in Israel, they're already governing in Israel, and they had enough with the Jewish people, enough of the Jewish communities. It wasn't working out. The Jews were not submitting to them, and it was time just to bring destruction to the communities and destroy, eventually, their temple in Jerusalem. And so we learn of many wars, many battles in many cities throughout Israel. And finally, as you know, in the year 70 before the Common Era, that's when the Romans actually came in. 70 after the Common Era, my apologies. We're talking after the Common Era right now. They actually come in and destroy Jerusalem and destroy the temple. Now, for a number of years, up until then, Jews had been running and trying to hide. Where were one of the places they were trying to hide? They went down to the south of Israel to the MASADA fortress. What's the MASADA fortress? It was a fortress, a palace built on a 1,200-foot mountain by King Herod. King Herod, the Roman king, the Roman governor of Israel, who is an interesting character. And whilst he brought a lot of death and slaughter to Jewish people and rabbis and sages, he also did a lot of good things for the Jewish community. He rebuilt and renovated the temple. He's a complicated figure. Well, he built this for himself in the mountains. He originally built it because he wanted a place to escape from the Egyptians he was afraid of, but it also served as a vacation home for Herod. And we know he built lots of magnificent structures that many of them still stand today. This is a magnificent structure. If you have been there, you know about it. If you haven't been there, you can look it up. And it was a palace. There were bathhouses. There were many food storage rooms. There were many water systems. With engineering, it's brilliant to see what they built over there. They managed to capture all the rains that were flowing down from all the mountains from wherever and capture them in these systems. So theoretically, you could live there in the luxury of a very comfortable palace with wonderful bathhouses and heating systems as well. And you had enough food to supply you for endless amount of time and enough water as well, which was the big issue in the desert. That's the MASADA fortress. Now, at this point, before the destruction of the temple, many Jews already fled there to hide there. It was a good hiding point because you're so high up and you're surrounded by these fortresses and these walls, which were built as well. It was very difficult for any enemy to make their way up there. After the destruction of the temple in the year 70, many more Jews went to hide there, to escape the Romans. And so it's estimated that by the year 73, there are approximately close to 1,000 Jewish people hiding there. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Just one moment. Sorry. Okay, Avi, come. Let's go to Mommy. Let's go to Ima. Wait, are you okay? Okay, please close the door, Avi. Can you close the door very tight? I'm just going to lock the door. Sorry. Okay, my apologies. That's what happens in quarantine at home. Now, where were we? So after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, so now the Romans are trying to defeat the final vestiges of Jewish people all over the country. And so in the year 72, 2 years after the destruction of the temple, they know about these 960 or 1,000 Jewish people hiding in MASADA, and they lay siege around them, preparing to destroy it. They lay siege for an entire year, trying to make efforts to get up there, but as you know, the path is a snake path and other paths. It's very difficult to get up there, and you're at a big disadvantage because the people up there can just throw the arrows and the rocks and the spears or whatever it is. It was impossible. They were surrounding there with 15,000 Roman soldiers, most of them from the 10th Roman Legion, and they were unable to. Finally, they came up with a plan. There was a very big fortress wall surrounding the mountain, and so they built a huge battering ram with thousands of tons of rocks and soil. It was built by the Roman soldiers, but it was also built, this is important to know, by many Jewish prisoners of war. The Jews were building the battering ram that will allow access for the Romans to the mountain to kill the Jewish people over there. The people living on MASADA saw what's going on over here. The Romans are eventually going to be able to break down this wall, and so they built another wall inside of that stone wall, and this wall is built of wood and of soil, softer structures. And so the battering ram, even after they successfully destroy that wall, they're unable to destroy this softer wall, which won't cave into the many, many rocks that were thrown at it. Eventually, the Romans came up with a plan, and so they shot arrows of fire. Many arrows, thousands of arrows of fire were shot at this wall. This wall had a wood foundation, and so very soon, overnight, the wall went up in flames. And now the stone wall is destroyed, and the wooden and earth wall is destroyed, and now there is access for the Romans to go up to the mountain. They say it was the first day of Pesach that they arrived on this mountaintop in the year 73 after the Common Era. They're expecting to find Jewish troops, 1,000 people armed with swords and spears and arrows with a battle. When they get up there, they find a surprise that they never imagined. They find 1,000 dead bodies of men, women, and children lying there on the mountaintop. Not a single person was alive. What happened? The night before, when the leader Elazar ben Yair realized what's happening over here, he stood up and he made a speech. And it could be that we know some of the speech that he made. He turned to the people, the men, women, and children around him, and he said, "We have it in our power to die nobly and in freedom. Our fate at the break of day is certain capture, but there is still the free choice of a noble death with those we hold most dear." And apparently, he instructs the father of each household to kill their wives and their children, and then to kill themselves. And then everyone was dying until the last two people were Elazar ben Yair and another one of the leaders of the community. Elazar ben Yair killed him, and then he went ahead and killed himself. And so they commit that night a large act of suicide, killing themselves so as not to be taken captive and being captured by the Romans. Wow, what a story. Question. Here's the question. It's an amazing story. Now, if you look in our Talmud, and we've been studying some of these ideas in the past few weeks in our Outlandish Talmud series, there are many, many stories about before the destruction and during the destruction and after the destruction. And stories that don't just record the successes of Jewish people, but also the downfalls of Jewish people, the death, the massacre. We don't hide from our stories, from our history. And with so many stories being recorded about so many Roman generals and so many Jewish leaders, about so many Jewish communities around Israel, one needs to ask themselves a question and be very confused by the fact that there's no mention of the story of MASADA in the Talmud. Not in the Talmud, not in the Jewish Medrash. Nobody talks about the story. Why? Another question. How do we know this story? Where does the story come from? So the only source, or perhaps almost the only source we have of this story, is from a person none other than Josephus. You may have heard of Josephus. He wrote a couple books about the Roman and Jewish history. Josephus was a Jewish person. He was born with the name Yosef ben Matityahu. His father was a Kohen, and his mother came from a very royal lineage. And the story with Josephus is that in the year 67, after the Common Era, a few years before the destruction of the temple, well, like I said, the Romans are already fighting their wars. He was a general of a Jewish army in a northern city in the Galilee. And they were facing heavy opposition from a Roman army. And they saw that it's impossible. So they make a decision. They're all going to kill themselves. It's a very similar story than the MASADA story that he tells. And they're all going to kill themselves, which they all do, except for one, or maybe two people. One of those people is none other than Josephus. He decides not to kill himself. Until the next morning when Vespasian, the Roman general, comes, expecting him to fight battle, and he sees everybody is dead except for him. And Vespasian is about to kill him. And then apparently Josephus tells Vespasian, listen here, your honor, trust me, I want to tell you something you need to know. You're one day going to be the Roman emperor. And Vespasian was very flattered and very intrigued by this person who's giving him this news, which actually ends up happening in the future. Like another story we know with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, we've told it before. And so Vespasian takes Josephus, or Yosef ben Matityahu, as a captive, takes him back to Rome. He's a prisoner for a couple of years, but eventually when the story comes true that Vespasian does become the Roman emperor, he releases Josephus. And then what happens to Josephus? So he takes on the Roman name, Titus Flavius Josephus, and he becomes, what it seems to be, that he becomes a very close friend and connection with the Roman emperor and his family and the government. He's a very wise man. He's a very brilliant, talented person. He becomes a translator for them, and he becomes an ally for them. And so now he's sitting in Rome. He's a Jewish person sitting in Rome, friends with the Roman army and emperor and government, and that's the role that he plays. And he also records several books of the history of what was going on at the time. Now, he didn't see a lot of what was going on. A lot of what was going on is what he heard about. He's sitting in Rome. How does he know about the stories happening in Jerusalem or in Israel without any YouTube footage or anything? So he's recording what he heard. What is our view in general of Josephus? So it's not clear exactly how we have to view Josephus in terms of his character before we analyze his writings. We don't find anywhere in the Talmud that the Talmud rejects him. There's many people, traitors to the Jewish community. The Talmud clearly says, we reject them. They left our community, they faulted on us, and they traded to the enemy. We don't have that about Josephus. In fact, there's no mention at all about Josephus, not for good or for bad. It's very hard to judge Josephus. Did he make the wrong decision by not killing himself and everyone else killed themselves? Maybe, maybe not. What right did he have to kill himself? Perhaps he wasn't going to be killed. Perhaps he's just being taken as a slave. Perhaps he could save his life. Maybe he was right for not killing himself and choosing not to commit suicide. What happens when he gets there? Well, hard to judge. We don't know we weren't there. Hard to judge if he's making wrong decisions, right decisions. Was he really working for the Romans? Was he a spy for the Jewish? We don't know much about Josephus. So that's a general overview of his character. Talking about his books, well, that's another question. How reliable is the history that he tells us? So this is an important point, because I want to explore why is there no mention of this story in the Talmud or in the Medrash or any Jewish sources, as we asked. So the first answer that some scholars and academics and historians give is that the whole story of MASADA is actually a myth and a legend, but never truly happened. That's one answer. I know it's a surprising or hard answer for many of us who may be hearing it for the first time, But there's a lot of writing suggesting that Josephus made up this story. It has so many similarities to other stories. The story of his battalion who committed suicide before they were caught. There's other stories as well of similar nature. That it could be that Josephus concocted this whole story. It never really happened. And so we, the Jewish people, knew that we were never told this story. It's Josephus who made it up in his book, The Book of War. And that's why it was never recorded in the Jewish literature. By the way, there are sources that say that there were some survivors from MASADA. Some say that 2 women and 5 children hid in one of the water cisterns. And if that's the case, and they did survive, did they avoid Roman capture? And if they did avoid Roman capture, who are they and where did they go? And did they tell the story and what happened for the rest of their lives? We also don't know. You see, this is studying history, and history in a time when there was no video footage, and it's very difficult to know what happened, especially nowadays to look back. So one answer is that the reason why it's not recorded is simply because it never happened. It's not true. And we have built up this whole story and legend for thousands of years, and it's not even true. That's a hard answer to swallow, but it might be a true answer. I don't know. There's another answer. Another answer is that the story happened, but the reason why the Jewish sages never recorded the story is because they disapproved of the whole story and of the people there. Because who were the people there? You may recall, and I've taught about this many times, that in the Jewish community at the time when the Romans are fighting wars and battles to take over Israel, there are a number of factions. There's rivalry, almost like a civil war in the Jewish community. There were on one end a very extreme group called the Zealots. And the Zealots were people who did not want to tolerate anything about the Romans. And they said, we need to fight back. Let's fight against them. Why should we play like cowards and go like sheep to the slaughter? Let's fight. Most of the rabbis and the leadership and most others disagreed with them. There's no point in fighting a lost battle. We are so few in number. We have such an incapable military against the large and powerful Roman army. What's the point in fighting this battle? Let's play along. Let's use some diplomacy. Let's try to negotiate. Let's be once. Maybe we can save our lives. Maybe we can save other people's lives. Maybe we can save some of the communities and the lands and the cities in Israel. And that was a very strong tension in the Jewish community. It became very sad and tragic because the Zealots burned a lot of the food supply in Jerusalem when they were laying siege, almost like forcing people to either fight or to starve to death. It's a very sad story. The people that ran to the MASADA fortress to hide were a group of the Zealots. And most of the leading rabbis disapproved of the Zealots, their whole view and their efforts in general, and disapproved of what they were trying to do, to go and hide in MASADA and then fight back. What are you trying to fight? And anyways, you brought so much destruction to our own people in Jerusalem when you burned our food and tried to cause the pressure us to fight, and you brought so many to die of hunger. So there was a general disapproval of these Jewish group. And so therefore that whole story was erased in Jewish literature simply because we don't like them. They had the wrong views, they were the wrong side of history, and they get no mention in our Talmud or Medrash or Jewish writings. That's one explanation. Another explanation why the rabbis disapproved of them is a similar one, but this is I read from Rav Hershel Schachter. He writes, their efforts were shelo b'rtzon chachamim. Their efforts were against the will of the sages simply because we have a principle. You don't fight a lost battle. You don't fight a war you can't win. You're not allowed to fight a war you can't win. Because what's the point? What's the point? If you're sure not going to win, you're going to lose, and maybe what are you trying to gain? And so not only that disapproved of that group of people, but this disapproved of their whole thinking, and it was a wrong approach. And therefore, it's not something that's recorded in Jewish literature simply because it's not something that we should be learning from. But what I want to do now is go into a final discussion, a final point about this that will lead into a very fascinating and painful and difficult conversation. What did they do? Elazar ben Yair and the other 1,000 people on the mountain. they all committed an act of suicide. They killed themselves. Why did they kill themselves? They reasoned, if we're not going to kill ourselves, we're going to be, well, they weren't sure. They don't really know what's going to. Were they going to be killed the next morning by the Romans? Maybe, maybe not. Were they going to be taken captive by the Romans? Maybe, maybe not. Would they become slaves to the Romans? Would the women become sex slaves to the Romans? What would happen to them? They don't really know. And without really knowing that something bad will happen, but it's not clear how bad and to what extent, they chose instead to take their own lives. Now, suicide is a terrible thing. Suicide in general is a terrible thing. Sadly, today, in the past few months, during this whole pandemic and quarantine and lockdown, suicide has become an even bigger issue going on over here. Whilst we're trying to solve the coronavirus issue, which is very, very important, we have to solve bigger issues perhaps. More deaths are happening from the depressions and the suicides and the financial crises, other things going on, which is a very important thing that needs to get spoken about more. But is suicide ever allowed? Are you ever allowed to kill yourself? Of course, if nothing is wrong in your life, you're not in danger, then going ahead and killing yourself is not allowed. This is not your life. You didn't create yourself. God gave you your life. God gave you your body. God gave you a mission. You need to hold on to it as a precious gift. If you're going through something, if you're not well, and if you're not appreciating who you are, you need to seek the help you need. But suicide is never an option. It's illegal according to Jewish law. But what about when there is a danger at hand? What about when there's something at stake? You may be killed instead by someone else. You may be taken as a captive, as a slave, raped, tortured, who knows what. Are you then allowed to commit suicide to save yourself from death from another, or from that kind of humiliation and pain from another, or not? That's the big question. And that's the question that gets heavily debated in the Talmud and in many ancient sources, and it's also a modern question that came up in the Holocaust and in Israel, as we're going to get to. Let's try to figure this out. Look in your source sheet. I want to go through a few sources with you. You can download it. You have the link on Facebook or on YouTube. Let's go through some of the sources. We're going to go through a few sources that tell us about stories of suicide, of voluntary suicide in Jewish history. The first story in source number 1 is from the book of Shmuel, number 1, in the book of Prophets, chapter 31, verses 1 to 5. This is the story of King Shaul. King Shaul, the first Jewish king. And he had already done things that disappointed God. And the prophet Shmuel had told him, your days are numbered, your end is near. And then there became a threat from the Philistines, from the Philistines. And Shaul was not sure, should he go into war, should he not go into war? Normally, he asked the high priest to use his Ruach HaKodesh, his divine foresight, to speak to God. Shall we or should we not go into war? Remember, you can't go into war that you can't win. And this time he consults with the high priest, and the high priest does not give him an answer. And he's very disappointed. Why is God not answering him? He's always answered him before. And there's a story, this is already after Shmuel, his mentor, the prophet, passed away. It's a famous story. He went to the witch and he brought up the soul of Shmuel. Not for now. Another fascinating story. Even though he was so against witchcraft, the Torah is against witchcraft, and he killed all the witches of the land, he still himself did the witchcraft to communicate with the soul of Shmuel. Anyhow, he doesn't get his answer. He's not sure, but he decides to go into war, into battle, because he thinks as the king, this is what he needs to do to lead and protect the Jewish people. That proves to be his final battle. That's the battle that he's going to lose. And what he realizes is, that's the battle that the prophet Shmuel was telling him, where he's going to lose his life. And so let's read these verses. And the Philistines fought with Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines, and the slain fell on Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines overtook Shaul and his sons. And the Philistines killed Jonathan, Avinadav, Malchishua, all of King Shaul's sons. He saw them all killed in front of him. And the battle fell heavy upon Shaul. And the archers found him, and he was very much frightened of the enemy archers. So Shaul turns to his own weapon bearer, and he says, draw your sword and run me through with it, lest these uncircumcised men come and run me through with their own swords and mock me. Kill me before the enemies kill me. But his weapon bearer was unwilling. He was very much afraid. You can't just kill a king. And so Shaul, without hesitating, takes his own sword, places it on the ground, and he falls on top of his own sword. He kills himself. And then his weapon bearer saw that Shaul had died, the king had died, and so he also fell upon his sword and died with him. Tragic. So sad. Shaul kills himself. What would be the alternative? We don't know. Maybe the Philistines would kill him. Maybe they would just capture him. Maybe they will make him a slave. Maybe they won't. Maybe they'll torture him. He doesn't know. But without really knowing what's going to happen, he chooses to kill himself. A decision by a Jewish king. No? Was it the right thing? Was it the wrong thing? Did the sages view this favorably or unfavorably? That's a good question. Let's continue. We have now two stories in the Talmud in Gittin 57b. Another two stories about suicide. Let's read it together. Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, and some say that it was Rabbi Ami who says, and some say that it was taught in a Breita. Somebody said this teaching, but it's a real story, it's a real teaching. There was an incident involving 400 boys and 400 girls who were taken as captives for the purpose of prostitution. Boys and girls. For prostitution, this is by the Romans. These children sensed on their own what they were expected to do, and they said, this is what the girls said. The girls said to themselves, if we commit suicide and drown in the sea, will we come to the eternal life in the world to come? That was their question. The oldest child among them expounded upon the verse that it says in Tehillim in Psalms that the Lord said, I will bring back from Bashan, I will bring them back from the depths of the sea. And they interpreted the last part of the verse, I'll bring them back from the depths of the sea, meaning it's referring to those who drown in the sea for the sake of heaven, killing themselves so as not to be captured and become a sex slave for the Romans. And so when the girls hear this teaching from the oldest girl among them, they all leap and fall into the sea and kill themselves. The boys then drew an a fortiori inference, kal vachomer, and they say with regard to themselves, if these girls for whom sexual intercourse with men is their natural way act in such a manner, then we for whom sexual intercourse with men is not our natural way should all the more so conduct ourselves likewise, because we're going to be treated even worse than the girls. And they too leapt into the sea and killed themselves. And concerning them, the verse says, as for your sake we were killed all day long, we are reckoned as sheep for the slaughter. 400 girls, 400 boys, they all killed themselves. The Talmud seems to be saying this story as something laudatory, something praiseworthy about them. They made a good decision. There's even a verse from scripture that is supporting what they're doing. And they chose the path of death on their own instead of becoming the slave for the Romans. Now, that's one interpretation of that verse. And now the Gemara goes with a whole long story of another interpretation of the verse. We won't go through the whole story, but I'll just the end is the important part of it here. Turn to side 2. Rav Yehuda said, I'm continuing in text 2. This verse we just quoted actually applies to a different story. Not the story of the 400 boys and girls, but rather to the woman and her 7 sons who died as martyrs for the sake of the sanctification of God's name. The woman with 7 sons who were all killed. Let's hear the story. The incident was that they brought the first of the women's sons before the emperor, and the emperor said to the son, worship this idol. He said, I cannot do so. The Torah says, I'm the Lord your God, only one God. They took one son out and they killed him. Then they brought in a second son, worship the idol. He quoted a different verse. I can't do it because the Torah says the second of the 10 commandments, you can't have any other gods. They took him out and killed him. Then they brought a third son, worship the idol. He says, I can't do that. And he quotes another verse in the Torah that sacrifices to any other God other than our true God should be destroyed. And they take him out and kill him as well. Then the fourth son, the emperor instructs, worship the idol. He says, I cannot do this. Why? And he quotes another verse. You shall not bow down to any other God. You cannot serve idolatry. They take him out and they kill him. Then the fifth son, the same story. I can't do it because there's a verse that says, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. We only have one God. They take him out and they kill him. And then the sixth son as well quotes another verse about our faith in God, refuses to bow down to the idol, and they kill him. Then it comes to the seventh son. 7 children. And the mother is watching this whole story. And they weren't killed very nicely, I'm sure. If you can even be killed nicely. It came to the final son. Worship the idol, the emperor instructs. And he says, I can't do it. And he quotes the verse from scripture. We already took a holy oath to the Holy One, blessed be he. We will not exchange him for a different God. And he too has taken an oath to us that he will not exchange us for another nation. We can't ever betray our God. Now, this was the youngest brother, the youngest son. And the emperor had some pity on him. So he wanted to spare his life. So he said, you know what? I'm going to throw down my seal on the floor. And you'll pick up my seal, bend over and pick it up, and people will think that you bow down to the idol, even though you're not. You're just trying to pick up my seal. Let's play a trick. I'm trying to save your life. The boy said to him, woe to you, Caesar! Woe to you, Caesar! If you think that for the sake of your honor, I should fulfill your command and do this, then for the sake of the honor of the Holy One, blessed be he, all the more so, I'm going to fulfill God's command and not your command. As they were taking the seventh son to be killed, the mother turns to the emperor. The mother who had already seen 6 of her 7 children be killed. She tells the emperor, my son, let me go ahead and give my son a kiss before he is killed. She goes over to him and she tells him, my son, go and tell our father Abraham in heaven. You only bound 1 son on the altar, your son Yitzchak, and you didn't have to kill him anyhow. And I have bound 7 of my sons, all my children on the altar, and they've all been killed to sanctify the name of God. It's a very painful story. But they're all killed by the emperor refusing to bow down to the idol. And that is a Torah law. A Torah law says, even though normally we try to do anything to save our lives, but when it comes to certain sins, 3 sins, we cannot commit them to save our lives. One of them being idolatry. If you're told to bow down to an idol, worship another god, or you'll be killed, you have to choose death. You're not killing yourself, someone is killing you, but you choose death over that sin. Then the mother, who has now seen all the 7 sons be killed in front of her eyes, she went up to the roof and she jumps off and she dies. She kills herself. And the heavenly voice comes out and quotes the verse from Tehillim, from Psalms, and says, Ei ma banim smecha, a joyful mother of children. She will go to heaven and be joyful for her decision and joyful that her children made their decision. As painful and as difficult it is to get our head around here in this world, but in the world of truth, she will be happy with her family knowing they've done the right thing. They did the right thing because they followed the law. Be killed rather than bow down to idols. But did she do the right thing? Was she allowed to commit suicide? Now, who knows what she's going through? And who knows what kind of state of mind she was in? How can we even judge her? But the Talmud doesn't say, she was sick, she was unwell, she was depressed, she had lost her mind, lost her senses. That's not what the Talmud says. The Talmud says she went up and she committed suicide, clearly, seemingly with a clear state of mind. And the Talmud says, Ema banim smecha, great job. You've done the right thing. We're proud of you. You've made a good choice and you'll be happy in heaven together with your children. We know many other stories of suicides throughout our history. There's a famous story in the 11th century, in the year 1096, with the Crusades. For those of you who are reading the Kinot prayers today on Tisha B'Av, we have an entire Kinot prayer, a lamentation prayer, talking about the story of the Crusades, especially the very bitter one in the year 1096, where the Crusades surrounded the communities, 4 very prominent Jewish communities of Spear, Worms, Mainz, and Cologne. And they gave the Jews the option, either convert to Christianity or you'll be killed. Now, of course, they didn't have the right to convert. According to Torah law, they should have been killed. But many of them, especially many parents, didn't want to see the Crusades, the Christians, killing their children. And so we know of mothers and fathers who go ahead and kill their own children first and kill themselves first so as not to be killed by the Christians. And we have a whole kinah lamentation. We read about that story today. And it says there in the refrain, in the stanza there, it says, "Who can see it and not cry? As the child is slaughtered, the father recites the Shema." The child's too young to say the Shema. The father saying the Shema before he kills his own child. Has such been seen or heard before? Apparently, somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 Jewish people were killed in the massacre, in the crusades of those communities. What are we to make of this? What is the right thing to do when you're faced with a choice? Not a choice of idolatry. That we know. You're not allowed to choose that. But when you're faced with a choice either to be killed by an enemy in a very undignified way, or to become a slave, or to be tortured, can you kill yourself? Must you kill yourself? Are you not allowed to kill yourself? Such difficult questions, and we're talking about this like it's easy to talk about. We have to always be careful to tread this with great respect and sensitivity. And so this becomes a great debate. We find in the medieval times, 11th, 12th century, many of the Baalei Tosfot, many of the medieval commentaries on the Talmud that lived in France and Italy, in Germany, they debate this. And we find that the debate is reawakened during the Holocaust, and the debate is reawakened in the 1950s and 60s after the founding of the State of Israel. Let's go through some of the sources. The final side on the source sheet. Source number 3. Source number 3 is the commentary of Tosfos, these medieval commentaries, on the story of the boys and the girls who jumped and killed themselves. And so they write, Rabbeinu Tam ruled. His name was Rabbi Yaakov. He ruled that when one fears that when taken captive, the enemy will force them to worship idolatry or subject them to brutal torture which they cannot tolerate, then it's a mitzvah to commit suicide. Rabbeinu Tam commented on those stories and he said, if you're going to be taken captive and you're not going to be able to tolerate, you're going to be in great state of torture and pain, they're going to abuse you, it's a mitzvah. Not just you're allowed to, you must, you should commit suicide. That was a very unique, groundbreaking opinion of Rabbeinu Tam, who was a very well-respected commentary and rabbi and codifier of Jewish law in the 12th century. However, not everybody agreed with that. If you look in Da'at Zekenim, Da'at Zekenim is a commentary of a group of these medieval commentaries on the Torah, not on the Talmud, on the Torah. And so in the verse of Bereshit, in Genesis chapter 9, verse 25, the verse says, V'ach et dimchem. However, for your own lifeblood, I'll demand an accounting. Well, you're allowed to kill an animal. However, you're not allowed to commit murder. And it says you can't commit murder to somebody else, to another human being. That's not allowed. And then God says a cryptic verse. It says, for your own lifeblood, I'll demand an accounting. What's it referring to? Your own lifeblood, I'll demand an accounting. Some say it's a prohibition against drinking blood, which you're not allowed to drink. But the Medrash and the Talmud say as follows. This is to be understood as an accounting for the death by people who deliberately strangle themselves as an act of suicide, avoiding the shedding of their blood in the process. The Torah is clearly saying you're not allowed to commit suicide, take away your own life, and it's framing it in a scenario where you did it in a way of not spilling blood because you strangled yourself, you hanged yourself, chas v'shalom, and so God says, I'm going to demand an accounting for your own lifeblood. On this prohibition of suicide, the Medrash explains, why do we need this verse? And why does it say ach? The word ach. Ach means however. It seems to be an exclusionary term. However what? Like what's is there an exception to this rule? So he says that we may think the story of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who were 3 great people that were going to be thrown in the fire by the Babylonians for not bowing down to the idol. We may think they were committing an act of suicide by willingly going and walking into this fire pit. albeit that is an act of sanctifying the name of the God. This was forbidden also. The reason for this verse, which was introduced with the word ach, was to exclude such suicides. No, since they were going to be killed or harassed or abused by the Babylonians instead, they had the right to walk into this fiery cauldron and kill themselves. They ended up being saved, by the way, but that was a miracle of God. They didn't know they're going to be saved. Even that of King Shaul, the story we learned earlier, who did not want to give the Philistines the satisfaction of having killed a Jewish king who had been crowned with the approval of the Lord. In both of these instances, the victims did not execute themselves, but were executed or meant to be executed by someone else. So, committing suicide with one's own hands is an absolute no-no, but if you're preserving something, you're protecting yourself from being killed by the enemy, or protecting your dignity, or look at King Shaul. King Shaul says, I'm not just a regular person going to be killed, a regular soldier going to be killed, I'm the king. If I'm taking capture, what kind of demoralization will that bring to the Jewish people where the king has been captured? There'll be no chance anymore to win this war or for the future. It'll be bringing absolute downfall to the Jewish people. Or if I'm going to be killed by them, all the worse. So therefore, their reasonings, their rationale was enough to support that they, in fact, can go ahead and kill themselves before they get killed or taken capture. That's one way of spinning the story. According to other opinions, that of Rabbi Shimon ben Avram and others, the rabbis did not make allowances for what King Shaul had done. King Shaul says these commentaries made the wrong decision. You had no business, no right to go ahead and kill yourself on your own sword. But you're going to be killed by others, but you're going to be taken captive and as a slave, but it may bring great demoralization to the rest of the Jewish people. Okay. What should we do? Tragic, but you can't kill yourself. Listen to this following story. He says, there's a true story of a rabbi who at the time of the persecutions of Jews practicing their faith, personally killed many young Jewish children in order to forestall the Christians from raising them in the Christian faith. A rabbi of a community saw the Christians coming. I'm not sure if this is the Crusades. This was the Crusades, yes. And he knew that they're going to be killed or taken and converted to Christianity or taken as slaves. And so he goes ahead and takes his knife, his sword, and he goes from house to house and starts to kill all the Jewish children. It's quite a job for a rabbi. I'm not very envious. One of his rabbinical colleagues was very angry at that rabbi on that account, referring to him as a murderer. The rabbi of the next door synagogue, next door city said, "You're a murderer, killing with your bare hands all the Jewish children." The first rabbi did not heed the second rabbi's warning not to become a murderer. Thereupon the rabbi opposed to the killing, the infants, said that if he had been right, if I'm right and you're wrong, meaning you should not be killing these children, then his colleague would die a violent and painful death. You will see, God will pay you back for this wrong decision you've made. You are going to be killed brutally. Not only did the Gentiles seize and kill that rabbi who killed all the infants, but they stripped off his skin and placed sand between it and his flesh. I don't really know how that works, but it sounds very painful. And this story is being told as if to say, the rabbi who made the decision to kill all the children before they're taken captive and converted by the Christians made a wrong decision. You have no business to kill anybody else, to kill yourselves, to commit suicide. Shortly thereafter, the decree forbidding the Jews to practice their faith was canceled. Now, here is a very powerful line. What happened in the end? In the end, the Christians did not come to convert and take capture all those children. And the children would have been spared, meaning they didn't come anymore. They walked away from their threat. If the first rabbi had not killed all the infants, they would have been saved when the decree was canceled. This is a very important line over here. You choose to kill yourself based on what you think may happen. Maybe I'll be killed. Maybe I'll be taken captive. Maybe I'll become a slave. Maybe I'll be tortured. Maybe, and maybe not. We can never know. And in this story, the rabbi who was so opposed to the other rabbi killing, and he made this test, I'm going to prove it to you because God's going to kill you in a gruesome way, and he was killed in a gruesome way. In the end, the Crusades walked away from this town. The threat was over. And were these children not to have been slaughtered by the rabbi? they would have all lived and survived. And so this adds to the confusion of the discussion over here. Even if you're allowed to kill yourself when the other definite alternative is becoming the slave or being killed, who knows how certain that's going to be? And maybe it won't happen. And now you've taken your life or your child's life for no reason. Warsaw Ghetto, 1943. Thousands every single day are being taken to the Umschlagplatz, to the gathering place by the train station, and taken off to Treblinka, where they're immediately gassed. Thousands are dying from starvation, hunger, or disease in the Warsaw Ghetto. If you've been there, you know what I'm talking about, because you can see everything and you can see how it was and how small and crammed it was. And so a band of people gather up, Ichalovich and others, and they say, we're going to fight back. And they gather a small little army of teenagers and young adults and children, and they collect guns and firepower and arrows and whatever they can collect, and some grenades and bombs. And eventually they start an offense against the Nazis. And it's a very powerful one, surprising to the Nazis. This goes on for over a month. And then many Nazis are being killed and shot. And they were not prepared for this. And it took Nazis to invade Poland just a couple of days, and then for over a month they cannot overpower this small group of Jewish people who are fighting back from the Warsaw Ghetto. This is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. In the end, the Nazis come with fully tanked up and prepared, and they mow down, and they kill so many, and they continue the transportations to Treblinka, and they bring a complete destruction to all Jewish life over there. We talk about this story, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Many will hold this in very high esteem. It's a sign of strength and power and the Jewish spirit. We will never go to the gallows and walk into the gas chamber like sheep to the slaughter. And in fact, Yom HaSha'ah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, was decided to be on the date where this uprising began, because we glorified their efforts. But you should know it wasn't so simple. Not everybody glorified their efforts. There were many leading rabbis in the ghetto itself, or outside of the ghetto, who saw and knew about this and commented on this, that said they'd made the wrong decision. Why? Because you, 50, 100, 200 people, will never have a chance to defeat the Nazi army. You'll have a chance to kill a few Nazis. You'll have a chance to forestall, to delay some of the transportations and the killings. You'll never. It's a war you can't win. And in fact, once you fought this battle, and you did have some success, but then the Nazis come in with greater power and completely bring to rubble the entire ghetto and kill everybody, maybe there would have been people there who would have had a chance to escape, who would have had a chance to come out alive. And because of your efforts, you didn't allow that to happen. That's another view of this story that doesn't get spoken about much, because it's not a very positive, favorable view. But again, there are the same two views about that, simply because we don't really know what the right answer is over here. This is a very difficult question. The same question arose in the 1960s in Israel. There became a very fierce debate between two great rabbis in Israel. Rabbi Shlomo Goren, who was the IDF rabbi of the Israeli army, and later became the Ashkenazic chief rabbi. And he was there in 1967, as you recall, coming down to the Kotel and blowing his shofar. He was a great scholar and a great halachic ruler. And he debated against another very great rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Tzvi Neriah, who was also a great Talmid Chacham. He was a Rosh Yeshiva of the Bnei Akiva Yeshiva in Kfar HaRo'eh. He also served in the Knesset for the National Religious Party. And he was one of the great students of Rabbi Avraham Isaac Kook, who was also a chief rabbi of Palestine and a great scholar and philosopher. And they debated, going all the way back, they debated the story of MASADA. And the reason why they debated that story was because they had to make some real decisions about the IDF army in their time. Rav Goren said that Elazar ben Yair and the decision of all the families at MASADA was the correct decision. They were correct, they were noble, they were respectful and dignified by killing themselves, instead of possibly facing the outcome of being killed or taken captured by the Romans. And King Shaul did the right thing for killing himself. And the boys and the girls did the right thing for jumping off. And in the Crusades, the people who killed themselves and their own children, instead of being killed by the Christians, they also did the correct thing. And Rav Goren therefore says that when you're faced with the possibility of being killed or tortured or taken as slave, you're allowed to kill yourself. It's not considered suicide. It's considered being honorable and dignified. And so he ruled, for example, what happens when an IDF soldier is taken captive, is caught by the enemy? Now, when a soldier is caught by the enemy, this is very, very dangerous. Not only for that soldier who may lose his life or may be tortured, who knows what, but it's dangerous for the army. And it's dangerous for people in Israel. Because what kind of secrets does he know? And they may be able to get out of him with the right torture. What kind of intelligence? What kind of information? And so the question became, what should this soldier do? And Rav Garner ruled that when an Israeli soldier is taken captive, he must commit suicide before he can be tortured and before they can try to gather information from him, which will put harm to the army and harm in Israel's way. There was actually a story that happened in the 1950s. I forgot the name of the soldier who was caught. I forgot his name. And he did commit suicide. He killed himself. Maybe he had a cyanide pill or whatever it is. I think the soldiers today carry a cyanide pill. I think so. I'm not sure. And it became debated by the rabbis and others, did he do the right thing or the wrong thing? Rav Goren came out and ruled he did the right thing. That was Rav Goren's opinion. But Rabbi Neriah, he opposed the ruling of Rabbi Goren. He said, absolutely not. The people in MASADA did the wrong thing. They had no business killing themselves. Shlomo HaMelech perhaps was the wrong thing. Or maybe there was extenuating circumstances because he was a king and because of the kind of impact it would have on the rest of the people. Other stories throughout history, they've been wrong. Like the Medrash said, we learned before that the rabbi who killed all the children was in the end in vain because the children could have survived because the Crusades walked away from that threat. Rav Neriah said, Jewish people don't choose that way. We don't make the choice of killing ourselves. He reasoned, if we would have taken any dangerous situation and chosen to kill ourselves, in all the situations of Jewish history, he says, we wouldn't be here today anymore. We'd be killing ourselves left, right, and center. There were so many instances, so many temptations where we could have killed ourselves. I mean, just imagine all of the hundreds of thousands or millions of Jews sitting in concentration camps in Auschwitz, in Treblinka, in others, in Dachau. They don't know what's going to happen to them. Maybe they're going to be taken at the selection tomorrow and taken to the gas chamber or deported from the ghetto. Maybe, maybe not. Now, thank God we know many did not get killed in the gas chamber. Many were not deported. Many survived. And whether they managed to escape or whether they were actually there at liberation. What if they would have all made a choice? This is not going to work out well for us. We may as well kill ourselves. How many more Jews would have been killed? There'd be no survivors at all from the Holocaust if they would have all acted like Elazar ben Yair and others and chosen to kill themselves so as not to be humiliated, tortured, or butchered by the Nazis. So Rabbi Neriah says, we don't do that because we never really know what's going to happen. Let nature take its course. Let God intervene. Maybe it's not going to happen as you think. Maybe the Romans won't be able to come and overpower us. And even if they will, maybe we'll be able to escape. And even if we can't escape, maybe we'll still be able to live. And one day we'll be let free. You never know what's going to happen. So let's summarize. In conclusion, did Elazar ben Yair and the people on MASADA make the right decision of killing themselves before the Romans could get to them, or not? The Torah has an answer. There is a correct answer about them, about the Jews in the times of the Crusades, and about all the other stories. But we don't have the answer. We don't know. We have many opinions, with many variables and many doubts and confusion. We cannot condemn those who do that. And maybe we shouldn't be supporting those who do that. We can definitely take a lesson from them. We can definitely be inspired by them. It's not our place, it's not our business to decide did they do the right thing or the wrong thing, whatever choice they made. We have no idea. As you can see, even in the medieval times, the Tosfos were arguing and debating about this. Even in the 60s, great rabbis in Israel were arguing about this. None of us can say what is right and what is wrong. But we can learn from our rabbis and their opinions. We need to tread these stories with great sensitivity. In fact, we need to be thankful to these people. They inspire us. MASADA is a place that inspires us today. When you go there, and people will celebrate their bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs there, or other kinds of occasions, and you go there and you explore what happened in Jewish life over there, and you feel it. You can almost hear their voices when you're standing over there in the synagogue or in one of the bathhouses, in the mikveh, one of the other places, and you can think about what they were living in, the threat, the challenge they were facing. All you can do is stand there with awe and humility and be grateful by their sacrifice and be grateful for their deep fight for the Jewish people. I don't know if it was right or if it was wrong, but I know that it's very powerful. And I know that it's something to learn from. Hopefully, and thank God, you and I will never face that decision. And so this will never become a practical question. It's theoretics. We can explore this in hindsight. But we have to be motivated. We have to be empowered by the great sacrifice of many of our ancestors throughout history, who gave their all, slaughtered their own children and themselves so as not to be defiled and taken captive by the enemies. And what we learn, therefore, is that whilst the Jewish body can be killed, the Jewish spirit will always live on, and the Jewish community will always live on. Whilst the Torah scroll can be burnt, the Torah's messages and ideas can never be erased. Am Yisrael Chai. Shelo yichben nero le'olam va'ed, the light of the Jewish people will never become extinguished. After the destruction of the temple, people thought this is the end. It wasn't the end. After the many crusades and the Spanish Inquisition, people thought this is the end. After the Holocaust, people said this is the end. It's not the end. And thank God we're alive, bigger and better than ever, doing all we can, but we can do more to bring greater Jewish pride to ourselves, to our families and communities, and to take the message of the Torah and to show how eternal they are and how illuminating they are, that we live by them. We model the Torah's values. We model that to everyone else. And hopefully, this will be the end of Jewish suffering, the end of any such dilemmas, the end of any such threats. All those who need to be healed will be healed. The world will have healing. The world will have shalom, will have peace. The world will have the unity that we need so desperately. And we pray that on this Tisha B'Av, we should merit to witness the Geula Shlema, the ultimate redemption. May it happen b'mheira v'yameinu, amen, speedily in our days. Thank you for joining us. I hope your fast for the rest of the day goes well and smooth. And see you in Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh. God bless you.